I awoke suddenly, as if someone invisible had tugged me by the shoulder. The room was steeped in darkness, with only the faint outlines of old cabinets and abandoned paintings barely visible in the moonlight filtering through a small window. I hadn't been in this house for many years, but now, after my grandmother's death, I had come to sort through her belongings and, perhaps, finally close the door to the past. Yet, with my very first steps, I felt that something was wrong, that every plank, every faded corner held more than just memories. This house was old, and I knew that such houses often produce sounds, as if they led lives of their own. But this creak was different. It seemed to respond to my presence, drawing closer, slow, and relentless. Fighting the tremor in my limbs, I stood up, fumbled for the light switch, but the light didn't come on. Cursing my fatigue and unease, I moved to the door and cautiously peeked into the hallway. There was no one there. Only the faint echo of my breath filled the silence, broken occasionally by the soft sighs of the wooden beams, as old as the house itself, as old as all the secrets it harbored. An odd, inexplicable sense of dread gripped my heart, like a faded memory trying to resurface. This house had once been so close to me, yet now it felt foreign, even hostile. I stood in the dark hallway, not fully understanding what had stirred this sudden rush of fear. Every corner seemed filled with something unseen, yet all the more real because of it. Deciding it was simply due to exhaustion, I returned to bed, but I could no longer sleep. The sounds had stopped, but I knew, whatever it was waiting, simply biding its time. The next morning, I wandered through the house, sorting through old belongings and trying not to dwell on the strange events of the previous night. I knew it was just fatigue and the gloomy atmosphere that were fraying my nerves. The house was filled with things my grandmother had kept for decades. Dusty boxes with photo albums, yellowed letters, and tiny porcelain figurines. I had barely begun organizing when the phone rang. The screen lit up with a name, Lucas, an old friend. He immediately invited me to a private party set to take place in an abandoned barn nearby. At first, I wanted to decline, but his cheerful tone was so infectious that I agreed, hoping it would distract me from the oppressive mood of the house. The barn was unrecognizable. It had been transformed into something between a gallery and a bar. Thundering music, graffiti-covered walls, chaos, and smoke. The party was in full swing even before I arrived. I walked along the walls, examining the installations, trying to spot Lucas, when my gaze suddenly landed on a familiar face in the crowd. My heart skipped a beat. Jacob, my cousin. We hadn't seen each other in years, and he had changed a lot in that time. Tall, with a light stubble and a somber expression, he was nothing like the carefree boy I used to be inseparable from. He noticed me too, and with a slightly awkward smile came closer. A wave of memories washed over me, warm, yet for some reason tinged with unease. We hugged, but he immediately pulled away, as if afraid someone might notice us. "You came back," he said quietly, looking at me with a faint smile that hid a trace of worry. "I didn't think there was anything left that could bring you here." "Grandmother's house," I replied, unsure what else to say. "I need to get things in order there." Jacob nodded but said nothing more. A shadow flickered in his eyes, something incomprehensible, deep as if he knew something he was reluctant to reveal. We stood surrounded by people, yet I felt as though an invisible, palpable barrier had formed between us. This barrier was woven of memories, unspoken words, and secret thoughts that I couldn't yet explain. After we spoke briefly, Jacob suddenly looked away and mentioned he had to leave. His face took on a concentrated expression again, and there was a flicker in his eyes. Something like fear, or maybe shame. I wanted to ask him what was wrong, but something held me back. It was as if some part of me already knew that the answer might be too heavy for both of us. The next morning, I felt drained. Memories of the night's encounter with Jacob refused to let me rest. It was as if we were both waiting for something, an invisible thread connecting us, yet neither of us dared to pull it. Had I thought about this as a child? Hardly. But now it was clear that Jacob had changed, and our bond was no longer just friendly or familial. it held something else, something I would need to understand. I decided to visit my grandmother's grave, hoping to find some peace. Autumn had painted the trees in dark, heavy shades, and the air was filled with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The cemetery seemed deserted, silent. I felt my restless, noisy thoughts begin to dissolve in the stillness, and a heavy, inexplicable calm spread through me. After standing at my grandmother's gravestone for a while, I lifted my eyes and suddenly noticed a dark figure moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, or perhaps one of the rare visitors to the cemetery. But the figure moved too quickly and seemed to be deliberately trying to stay hidden. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The uneasy feeling that had overwhelmed me the night before returned with full force. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing off the stone tombstones. The figure froze, then disappeared, melting away behind an old, towering oak. My heart beat too fast, as if it knew something my mind refused to acknowledge. Acting on impulse, I took out my phone and dialed Jacob's number. He answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting for my call. "Jacob, can you come to the cemetery?" I asked, trying to mask the nervousness in my voice. "Did something happen?" His voice held a trace of tension. "It's just, I don't know, maybe it's silly, but I saw someone here. It might be nothing, but I can't shake this strange feeling." Within 20 minutes, Jacob was there by my side. "I think you just imagined it," he finally said, avoiding my gaze. "This place can bring out feelings like that, especially when you're alone." "You feel it too, don't you?" I asked quietly, unable to hold back. He was silent for a long time, then gave a brief nod, and a shadow of memories, too painful to discuss just now, crossed his face. I realized I wasn't ready yet to know what weighed so heavily on him, but I knew it would become our shared secret. After the strange incident at the cemetery, Jacob suggested we distract ourselves and head to a night carnival that had set up on the outskirts of a neighboring town. I agreed without a second thought. I wanted to escape from the heavy thoughts and the flood of memories that wrapped around Jacob and me, tightening like vines, impossible to shake. We arrived at the carnival, and the atmosphere instantly swept me away. Tents filled with sounds, colors, and scents, fire jugglers, mysterious fortune tellers, and the hypnotic hum of the carousel. It felt as if time had frozen here too, but with a lighter, more vibrant pulse. I felt an unusual sense of freedom, like in childhood when Jacob and I would dive headfirst into any adventure. We moved through the bustling crowd, hopped on a few rides, laughed, and for a moment forgot about everything that had surrounded us in recent days. But when we stopped near the hypnotist's tent, something inside me grew cautious. "Let's go in," Jacob suggested, winking at me as if this were our old, familiar world where we were absolutely free. Before I could protest, we were invited inside. The tent was shrouded in a strange twilight, with a heavy scent of incense lingering in the air. Behind a low table sat the hypnotist, a tall man with a piercing gaze that locked onto me the moment we entered. "You," he said, nodding in my direction. "You look like a stranger in this world, with a soul trapped in other times." I was intrigued and a little taken aback. Before I could respond, he offered to hypnotize me, promising that I would see my past as if it were alive. Jacob smiled. His expression was calm, but I could sense him watching me closely, as if afraid this experience might unearth what we had been hiding from ourselves for so long. I agreed, and the hypnotist began his strange, slow chant. His voice penetrated me, pulling me further and further, immersing me in the fog of childhood memories long faded in my mind. Suddenly, I recalled a summer when I was 14. Jacob and I, young and inseparable, playing, sharing secrets, and building our small worlds that no one else could enter. I felt images surface: our treehouse, the old camp where we spent our holidays. At some point, the memories sharpened, as if they had come alive. Warm evenings, carefree conversations, and an unexpected, unfamiliar feeling of shyness I felt around Jacob, not yet understanding what it meant. It was strange, confusing, and a little disorienting, but oddly thrilling, like a faint light somewhere deep within my soul. When the hypnotist brought me out of the trance, I looked at Jacob and noticed that he, as if seeing everything I'd felt, appeared unsettled. I tried to ask him what was wrong, but he just brushed it off, avoiding my gaze as if afraid I might see something he hadn't meant to reveal. This mysterious carnival night became yet another hazy shadow over us, as if the past and present had merged, leaving us in this strange, blurred place where we were both trapped, together with our secrets. Returning home after the carnival, I felt exhausted and unsettled. The memories stirred under hypnosis lingered with me, and the image of Jacob standing in the tense half-light, watching me with concern, haunted my thoughts. It felt as though an invisible barrier still stood between us, built over years of silence and things left unsaid. Trying to make sense of my thoughts, I was surprised when Jacob suggested we have dinner at our grandmother's house. That evening, he arrived, and we settled in the kitchen, where everything remained as it had in those distant childhood years. The same worn stools, the creaky wooden table, the smell of spices, and my grandmother's dried herbs. This place held so many secrets and memories, a unique, timeless spirit, as if our grandmother were still watching over us from somewhere deep in the past. Over dinner, our conversation gradually drifted to memories of our childhood, to the games and pranks that filled our summer vacations. We struggled to hide the awkwardness, as though we were both skirting around something we both knew but didn't dare to say. At one point, Jacob broke the silence, asking if I remembered the old family legends our grandmother used to tell us. "You mean her stories about the house?" I asked, trying to understand where he was going. He nodded, his face turning serious, his eyes darkening slightly, as if this memory held as much weight as everything else we had discussed. He began recalling how our grandmother told us about lost rooms in the house, hidden places, and a family secret meant to protect our lineage. Those tales, which once seemed like pure fantasy, suddenly took on a new gravity and depth. "I found her letters," Jacob said, his voice trembling slightly, and he pulled several yellowed envelopes from his pocket, marked with our grandmother's neat handwriting. He laid them on the table between us. "They were hidden. I stumbled across them by accident," he added, looking at them with an expression as if they contained something dangerous. I opened the first letter and began to read. The lines spoke of events that had happened many years ago, things our grandmother had never openly shared with us. It turned out our family truly did harbor secrets, far more serious than childhood fantasies. In the letters, our grandmother mentioned a restless soul, a bound secret, and warned that this secret should not be disturbed, lest it disrupt the peace of the house. The words were cryptic and unsettling, but something inside me sensed that Jacob knew more than he was letting on. I looked at him, expecting some kind of explanation, but he remained silent. I could see a struggle in his expression. He wanted to say something, yet seemed afraid of the words themselves. His hand unconsciously tightened on the edge of the table, and I realized these letters had awakened something inside him, something that might be connected to both of us. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked quietly, feeling the tension in the air between us. "I thought—" He paused, lowering his gaze. "I thought maybe you'd remember something too. Something we forgot or didn't want to remember." His words stirred a wave of vague images within me, but they remained indistinct, like blurred shadows. We both sat in silence, realizing that these were not just old letters. They were a key to our past, to feelings that might once have run deeper than either of us had been willing to admit. Late that evening, shortly after dinner, Jacob suggested we drive out to the abandoned chapel on the edge of town. The idea struck me as strange, but I agreed, feeling as though something between us was on the verge of being revealed. We drove through the quiet night, the streets deserted, and the headlights illuminated only a small stretch of road ahead, leaving everything else shrouded in darkness. The chapel stood alone on a hill, surrounded by withered trees stretching toward the sky, as if trying to escape the grip of time. We stepped out of the car, and despite the cold wind, I felt a strange warmth emanating from this place, as though it remembered us and everything that had once happened here. Here, in this place where so much remained unresolved, It felt as if time itself had paused, waiting. We climbed the stone steps and sat by the entrance, watching the fog as it spread across the ground, swallowing everything around it. Jacob was silent, lost in thought, and I hesitated to speak, afraid to disturb the strange calm. It seemed we both knew that this was the place where memories would resurface, that the answers to our unanswered questions were hidden here. "Do you remember how we used to play here?" he finally asked, gazing into the distance. I nodded, feeling a slight chill at his words. As children, this place had been our secret refuge, a place where we hid from adults and shared our most treasured secrets. But now, sitting beside Jacob, I suddenly realized that our childhood memories weren't as simple as they had seemed. There were gaps between them, strange voids filled with unease and things left unsaid. "Ever since I returned to town, I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong," Jacob said, and I saw a shadow cross his face. "Here, on this hill, I feel it especially strongly, as if we've forgotten something. Or as if I'm hiding something." He lowered his head, and there was a note of regret, even fear in his voice. I understood that he wasn't just feeling nostalgic. This place was truly stirring something painful and unresolved within him. "Jacob, what are you trying to say?" I asked, my voice trembling as I realized his words unsettled me far more than I'd anticipated. "I'm not sure I can explain," he replied, exhaling as though he had finally made a decision. "But have you ever wondered why we stopped talking after that summer? Why we grew distant?" I fell silent, memories flooding back of the rare moments I'd asked myself the same question. "This place," he began again, staring into the emptiness. "I think it remembers us as we were then, and maybe I came back here to find answers to my questions, or perhaps to hear yours." The next day, Jacob suggested we take a trip to the abandoned camp where we used to spend our summer vacations. I agreed immediately. This place always stirred a strange nostalgia in me, and I longed to feel like that carefree girl I once was. We drove in silence, each lost in thought, but the closer we got to the camp, the more a sense of anticipation grew within me, as though something important was about to happen. The camp greeted us with silence. The dilapidated wooden cabins stood among overgrown paths, everything here wrapped in decay and forgotten memories. A slight shiver ran through me as we stepped onto the grounds. The place, though empty, seemed to still hold traces of past life, echoes of our childhood. We walked slowly along the old cabins, looking at the empty windows and crumbling walls, each step pulling us deeper into memories. Jacob suddenly stopped by one of the buildings and said quietly, "This is where we always used to hide from everyone. Remember?" I nodded, looking at the familiar porch. We always ran here, to this little cabin on the edge of the camp, away from the other kids and counselors. For us, it was a place of freedom, a place where we felt alone with our secrets. I smiled, but an uneasy feeling stirred again within me. "You know something changed between us that year, don't you?" he asked, holding my gaze. The words took me by surprise. I felt something tighten inside me. I thought back to that summer, how strange feelings had begun to develop between us, leaving me feeling confused and unsure. We had spent so much time together, more than either of us might have wanted to admit. Time had become a shared mystery, filled with vague, murky emotions. I don't know," I replied softly, sensing that Jacob could see my hesitation. "I remember how close you felt to me. But something did change. And I can't say exactly what." Jacob sighed, looking into the distance, and in his eyes I glimpsed a hint of regret, a deep inner struggle. "Don't you think we might not remember everything?" he asked finally, a muted fear in his voice. I realized he wasn't just talking about memories, but about something that lingered in our minds as a blurred, half-realized feeling. Perhaps we had indeed turned a blind eye to something too painful to confront at the time. "Sometimes I think I remember more than I want to admit," he added quietly. as if I made a decision for both of us back then. And now I'm not sure it was the right one. As we drove back from the camp, the sky suddenly darkened with storm clouds, and a heavy downpour began. Rain poured down in sheets, as if it were swallowing everything around us. We drove slowly, trying not to succumb to the oppressive silence. But the closer the flashes of lightning grew, the more intense the tension between us felt. Finally, when the rain became overwhelming, Jacob veered off the road and stopped under an old bridge where we often played as children, hiding from summer storms. I watched the river flowing beneath the bridge as raindrops drummed on the car roof, creating a sealed space, one we couldn't escape. Jacob sat beside me, and there was something in his expression I couldn't quite grasp. Dark and troubled, as if he had been fighting with himself for a long time but could no longer keep it in. "Do you know why I was afraid to come back here?" he suddenly asked, not looking at me, his gaze fixed on the dark water under the bridge. I sensed that he was finally ready to say something important, and I managed to ask, almost breathlessly, "Why?" He was silent for a long time, gathering his courage, then turned to me and finally spoke. "I was afraid that I'd feel again what I felt back then, when we were kids." His voice was thick with pain and uncertainty, as if he were admitting to something he hadn't yet fully understood himself. Those feelings, they were more than just affection, more than the usual bond between family. I felt the words catch in my throat. I didn't know how to respond. Those strange moments of closeness and confusion I'd felt with Jacob as a child came flooding back. And I realized he was speaking of something I had once been too afraid to even consider. "Jacob?" I began, feeling I had to say something, anything, to let him know he wasn't alone in this, that I, too, had been there and felt the same. I remember how complicated things were for us, but I thought it was just childhood feelings, misunderstanding. He looked at me, and I saw sadness and relief in his eyes. It was as though he had finally allowed himself to acknowledge what had been tormenting him for so long, something he'd tried hard to suppress and forget. There was sadness in his gaze, but also a deep connection and honesty I hadn't seen in years. "I regret never saying anything back then," he admitted quietly, struggling with the words. "I thought it would go away, that I could run from it if I just left. But each year that feeling only grew stronger. And now that I'm back, I realize I can't ignore it anymore." The storm raged around us, mirroring the turmoil we both felt inside. We sat in silence, understanding that this connection, this feeling we had tried so hard to forget, had never truly left us. I saw how Jacob wrestled with it, how he was searching for words to explain the weight he carried. I was always afraid I'd ruin everything. He finally broke the silence. "But now I think maybe the most important thing is simply to accept what is, not to try to forget it, not to fight it." For the first time, I felt a strange, bittersweet calm, a recognition that we had shared something profound and complicated, and that our lives had been shaped by it, whether we wanted to admit it or not. We sat there, rain pounding on the car roof, each of us slowly coming to terms with what had always lingered between us, the truth that had been hidden, yet ever present. The next few days passed in a hazy state. Jacob's confession had stirred something deep within me, exposing feelings I had kept hidden, unwilling to understand what they truly meant. We both avoided each other, knowing we needed time to process everything that had happened, to come to terms with these difficult emotions. It was during this time that my friend Lucas called and invited me to an art exhibit at a small private gallery. I accepted without hesitation. The thought of being alone, trapped in my own thoughts, was unbearable. I hoped that a night out might give me a reprieve, a chance to forget, even if just briefly. The gallery was cozy, filled with vibrant paintings, vintage photographs, and sculptures that seemed to reflect the artist's inner worlds. I wandered among the pieces, feeling at ease in the quiet, soulful atmosphere. Gazing at the faces in the portraits, I felt the tension of the past few days slowly melting away. At some point, a tall guy with a warm smile and attentive eyes appeared beside me. He introduced himself as David, one of the artists featured in the exhibit. We struck up a conversation quickly. He spoke about his work, about how he aimed to capture more than just facial features in his portraits. He looked for traces of people's pasts, the stories they carried within. You know, sometimes you can see entire family histories in a portrait, he said, gesturing to one of his pieces. Some things are passed down through generations, especially those hidden deep in the heart. His words resonated painfully, stirring memories of childhood, the abandoned camp, and Jacob's heavy gaze beneath the bridge. Unknowingly, David had touched a wound that had only just begun to heal. We continued talking, and I felt drawn to his gentle, kind demeanor. In his presence, I felt a quiet calm, almost like how I used to feel with Jacob back when we were just kids, just friends. David spoke of life, his love for art, and the importance of finding harmony between past and present. As the exhibit wound down, he suggested we meet again to discuss his new collection, which was due to be shown at the same gallery soon. I agreed eagerly, glad for the chance to have someone new in my life, perhaps even hoping that this could help me move on from Jacob and the tangled emotions he brought with him. Yet, as I left the gallery, I caught myself drifting back to thoughts of Jacob, his words, the struggle it had taken him to open up. David was interesting, kind, and I genuinely wanted to know him better, but the shadows of the past lingered, refusing to let me escape them. The next day, Jacob suggested meeting at the treehouse we'd built as kids. It was deep in the forest, just beyond the old camp, and once served as our secret hideout, a place where we'd spend hours away from adults, sharing secrets and dreams. His suggestion caught me off guard. I'd thought we'd avoid places like this after our recent conversations, but a part of me felt drawn there, pulled back to those memories and the simplicity that once defined our bond. We met at the edge of the forest and walked in silence toward the treehouse. Jacob led the way, his steps confident, as if he were returning to a place he'd never truly left. I followed, holding my breath, feeling as if I were on the edge of something unknown and painful. When we finally reached the treehouse, a strange thrill ran through me. Everything was just as we'd left it. The worn wooden floors, the shelves filled with our childhood treasures, silly drawings and notches carved into the walls from a time when we were still so young. We climbed inside, sat down on the floor, and for a while, we just sat in silence, each lost in our thoughts. In that treehouse, I suddenly felt like the girl I once was, reliving all the warmth and closeness Jacob and I had shared here, and as if experiencing it all anew, I realized how deeply I'd missed him, missed this indescribable feeling. "Do you remember how we promised to always be friends?" he finally asked, a hint of sadness in his voice. "I remember," I replied softly. Back then, everything seemed so simple. He looked at me for a long time as if preparing to say something he'd been holding on to for years. Then, quietly, almost in a whisper, he asked, "Do you remember that summer?" For a while, we were closer than just friends. I've thought about it all this time. Yes, I answered, feeling my cheeks flush. "I remember, but I didn't know you did too." All this time, I tried to forget. I told myself it was just a fleeting feeling, just something childish. But when you came back, it all came rushing back. I don't know what to do with it, but I can't deny it anymore. My heart ached, yet a strange feeling of understanding filled me. These memories weren't just illusions. They weren't fleeting feelings. Deep down, we both knew that the bond between us was real, something no one else could understand. A few days had passed since our meeting in the treehouse, yet I couldn't shake Jacob's words from my mind. His quiet, painful revelations had stirred something deep within me, leaving me feeling vulnerable, as if all the protective layers I'd carefully built around myself had been stripped away. It was then that Jacob proposed another meeting, this time at a place particularly meaningful to us, the lake where we had played as children. We took an old boat and made our way to a small island in the middle of the lake, the same place where we used to spend summer days, dreaming and creating imaginary worlds. The boat gently rocked on the waves, and we sat in silence, surrounded only by the soft lap of water and a light breeze running across the lake. When we reached the island, a sense of calm and focus settled over me. We sat on the shore, gazing out over the water stretching toward the horizon, and we both understood that here, far removed from everything else, it was finally time to speak openly. "I want you to know that I don't expect any answers from you," he began, looking at me with that deep sincerity that was always present in his gaze. "I just needed you to understand that these feelings haven't gone away. I tried to forget, but every time I think of you, it all comes back. You're something that stayed with me ever since we were kids. Jacob, I paused, searching for a way to express what I had been holding back for so long. I always thought it was just a childhood crush, but now, being together again, with all these feelings surfacing, I realize it was more. So much more. Sometimes I wonder how our lives might have turned out if we hadn't drifted apart, if I hadn't left," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Maybe things would be different. But even if they weren't, I still can't let go of this." I reached out, and he grasped my hand as if afraid that the moment would slip away if he let go. We sat there, silently acknowledging the bond that had connected us all this time, even when we were far apart. "I'm scared," I finally admitted, allowing myself to voice the fear I'd kept hidden for so long. "Scared that this bond could destroy everything we have. But, Jacob, I can't ignore it anymore. I'm tired of running." He turned to me slowly, his gaze filled with indescribable warmth and sadness. We sat there together, under the open sky in the middle of the lake, and it felt as though, for the first time in all these years, we had fully acknowledged the depth of our feelings. They were stronger and more profound than we had ever dared to believe.